Paul McCartney, the legend of legends, the priceless heartbeat of music. A rare gift the world may never see again. He is not only the voice that carried the Beatles across continents, not only the composer of melodies that became hymns of generations, he is the living pulse of an era, the man whose songs stitched together youth, rebellion, and hope into the soundtrack of humanity. In a music world driven by ego illusion and spectacle, McCartney has always stood apart. The humble boy from Liverpool who rose beyond the noise, the quiet craftsman of unforgettable songs, the generous spirit who turned fame into kindness. A human treasure whose artistry transcends fashion, whose melodies still echo across arenas and lonely bedrooms alike. And yet, behind the applause that never seemed to fade, shadows have followed him like ghosts. The sudden death of his mother when he was just 14, the brutal collapse of the Beatles that left him spiraling into depression, the cruel assassination of John Lennon, the farewell to George Harrison, and the unbearable loss of his beloved Linda. His life has been a cathedral, built as much on grief as on triumph, each stone carrying the weight of wounds the world rarely saw. Now, at 83, the man who once seemed untouchable faces the fragility of age solitude and the haunting truth that no song can silence loss forever. Do not look away, for what Paul McCartney endures now may be the deepest movement of his symphony of pain and resilience. The first wounds of Paul McCartney were not carved by the stage, nor by the merciless storms of fame, but by the fragile terrain of childhood itself. Born into a post-war world where ration books still sat on kitchen tables and the ruins of air raids lingered in memory, he learned early that joy was fleeting and stability was fragile. Before the world crowned him a Beatle, before his name filled stadiums, Paul was simply a boy in Liverpool, discovering that loss could strike before dreams had a chance to take shape. James Paul McCartney entered the world on June 18, 1942, in Walton Hospital, as bombs still echoed in the skies of Britain. His father, James Jim McCartney, a cotton salesman who played trumpet and piano, carried music in his veins, but bore the weight of financial struggle. His mother, Mary, a midwife and nurse, was the anchor of the household, bringing warmth to a modest home in a city still rebuilding from war. They were working-class, resilient, proud of simple survival. Even his name carried quiet strength, Paul, solid and timeless, and McCartney echoing Irish roots that spoke of endurance. Yet even in those earliest years, shadows were gathering at the edges of his story. Childhood offered him fragments of wonder, but never permanence. His family moved from one small home to another, from Speke to Allerton, carrying the uncertainty of post-war life. School was no sanctuary. Teachers noted his sharpness, yet beneath the quick wit was a boy already rehearsing grief. The family scraped through modest means, holding to music as the only steady inheritance. Jim played jazz records on Sunday afternoons, filling the air with trumpets and harmonies, while Paul's ear caught every note as if it were salvation. But beneath that music was a silence no child should have heard. At 14, Paul's mother died suddenly from breast cancer complications. One day, she was Mary. The strength of the house, the next she was gone, leaving a void no melody could mend. Paul later confessed that his greatest regret was the last words he ever spoke to her. Words he wished he could take back, a guilt that would bleed into the haunting line of yesterday. I said something wrong, now I long for yesterday. Before that, cruel rupture music had been his first refuge, his first identity. He learned piano from his father, then turned to a guitar bought cheaply, teaching himself chords until his fingers ached. Songs began to form, tentative but sincere like small prayers, whispered into the dark. When grief came, it was through music that he tried to speak again. His first composition, I Lost My Little Girl, carried the raw ache of a teenager, groping for words to make sense of absence. The melody was clumsy, the lyrics simple, yet they were carved from truth. Music became the sanctuary against the silence left by Mary's absence, a place where he could turn tears into something that endured. Childhood for Paul McCartney was a cruel apprenticeship, in grief one that foreshadowed the tragedies that would shadow his adult life. The boy who lost his mother too soon carried that wound into every song, turning sorrow into melodies that soothed not only his own heart, but millions of others. It was pain transmuted into beauty, absence reshaped into legacy. Decades later, he would still admit that grief never ends, it only changes shape. In that quiet truth lies the essence of his resilience. The boy from Liverpool who learned far too soon that life begins with loss, and that the only way forward is to sing through the silence it leaves behind. When the safe walls of childhood collapsed with the loss of his mother, Paul McCartney did not surrender to silence. Instead, music began to whisper, and a boy who had already tasted grief discovered that melody could be his refuge. The guitar became his sanctuary, each chord a fragile bridge over sorrow, each lyric a secret confession. What he did not yet know was that this new dream would demand not only talent, but the same hunger and resilience that had already defined his young life. In those early years, nothing was glamorous. Liverpool in the 1950s was a working-class port city, its streets scarred by bombings and unemployment. Paul practiced tirelessly, teaching himself guitar upside down, until he restrung it to fit his left hand. He carried it everywhere, rehearsing in small parlors and back rooms, fumbling toward songs that no one had heard yet. These weren't the stages of glory, but survival steps. He played at church halls and neighborhood gatherings, determined that music would not just be pastime, but salvation. The leap toward bigger dreams came in July 1957 at the Woolton Parish Fete. There, fate placed him before a boy named John Lennon. Paul, shy but eager, impressed him by tuning a guitar and playing 20 Flight Rock from memory. That moment was no accident, it was a threshold. Soon after Paul was invited into Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen, carrying little more than a battered guitar and a restless need to belong. They rehearsed in dusty rooms, scraped together coins for bus fares, and faced audiences indifferent or rowdy. Yet in those echoes lay the first outlines of destiny. Allies soon emerged who would anchor him. George Harrison, a younger guitarist of astonishing precision, became both friend and brother-in-arms. Later, Brian Epstein, a meticulous young manager from Liverpool, believed in their potential when others dismissed them as another loud skiffle band. And in George Martin, the EMI producer who recognized their raw talent, Paul found a mentor who challenged him to refine melodies into timeless anthems. In this circle, Paul discovered what childhood had denied him: a sense of family, bound not by blood, but by music. The first taste of success came with the explosion of Beatlemania in 1963 and 1964. With Love Me Do and She Loves You, Paul was no longer the grieving boy from Liverpool, but the cute Beatle adored by millions. The cheers were deafening, the headlines ecstatic. Yet even triumph carried its trap. To the world, he was the smiling face, the charming frontman, the boy next door with a bass. But Paul longed for more, to be known not just as an image, but as a composer capable of depth, as the architect of songs like Yesterday that carried shadows behind the melody. These beginnings were never triumph without cost. Each success was shadowed by the ghosts of his past, each ovation contrasted with the quiet ache of absence. The boy who had lost his mother, who found solace in a cheap guitar, was now chased by crowds across continents. Fame had arrived, but it was not a gift. It was another climb, another crucible. And yet, through doubt, through the labels that threatened to reduce him, Paul McCartney was already proving something greater than stardom. He was building endurance. The world had not yet crowned him a legend, but he had already revealed the truth that mattered most. He would not break. Paul McCartney entered the 1960s not as London's golden prodigy, but as Liverpool's restless outsider. A boy who had grown up in modest terraced houses carrying more grief than privilege suddenly found himself under lights brighter than anything post-war England had ever seen. The paradox was immediate. To fans, he was radiant, the charming face of youth culture. Yet, to skeptics, he was just another lad swept into a frenzy that surely could not last. Charisma met suspicion, and the young musician had to prove that his gift was not a fluke, but a force. The first breakthrough came with the Beatles' debut single, Love Me Do, in 1962. The song climbed to number 17 on the UK charts, modest compared to what would come, but for Paul, it was thunder in a sky that had long been gray. Within a year, She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand set off Beatlemania, turning 4 Liverpool boys into global icons. Stadiums shook, airports clogged with screaming teenagers. The Ed Sullivan Show pulled in 73 million viewers. Overnight, Paul was no longer the boy scribbling chords in his father's front room. He was the cute Beatle typecast by the press as the smiling one. The cheers were intoxicating, but the label was a trap, reducing him to an image when he longed to be heard as a serious composer. Stumbles were inevitable. Their 1967 film Magical Mystery Tour bewildered critics dismissed as self-indulgent. Paul bore the brunt of blame, painted as reckless in his ambition. Whispers in the press called him controlling, a perfectionist, too eager to lead. Yet even in the criticism, he carved depth. Albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band revealed his genius for pushing boundaries, blending classical strings with rock, and reshaping pop into art. Here he found allies George Martin, guiding arrangements with surgical precision, John Lennon sparring with him in tension that often produced brilliance. It was a fragile sanctuary, but it kept him afloat amid doubt. Then came the defining role of his career, Yesterday. Performed alone with an acoustic guitar and string quartet in 1965, it became one of the most covered songs in history, a hymn to regret and longing that carried echoes of his mother's death. Success was monumental, yet it was not gentle. The strain of touring left the band physically and mentally shattered. On stage, Paul looked invincible, charming arenas of 50,000. Off-stage, he was drained, sleep-deprived, his ears ringing, his body frayed by endless travel. Fame carved scars into him, even as it crowned him as a cultural symbol. And yet, when the Beatles fractured and the world doubted him most, Paul refused to break. In 1970, while critics dismissed his solo debut as fragile compared to Lennon's rawness, he built wings, endured jeers, and slowly forged a new chapter. By 1973, with Band on the Run, he resurrected himself, proving he could thrive outside the myth of the Beatles. Discipline carried him long nights in Lagos studios with stolen tapes and broken equipment. Yet, he emerged triumphant. The outsider had once again claimed the center. For Paul McCartney, glory has never been a gift. Every ovation has hidden exhaustion, every hit record carried shadows of pain. His fame was never handed down, it was carved into bone, written in sacrifice and sustained by a refusal to surrender. His legend was not a gift. It was a wound turned into fire. Paul McCartney has often been painted as the eternal optimist, the smiling Beatle, whose melodies seem to float above the noise of the world. Yet the story of his heart has never been the glittering carousel of fleeting romances that the entertainment press adored in others. His was a quieter path lived in whispers and silences, in relationships that began with tenderness and ended in shadows. While the stages of the 1960s were filled with screaming fans, Paul approached love with the fragility of a man who had already known loss too early. Behind every ovation lay the private knowledge that love could vanish, just as suddenly as a mother at 14, or a friend in the night. His first serious romance was with Dot Roan, a Liverpool girl he met in the late 1950s when both were teenagers. For a time, they dreamed together of stability, even planning a shared future that promised permanence in a life otherwise in flux. But fate was already cruel. Dot became pregnant, and before the child could arrive, she miscarried. For Paul, barely 18, it was a shattering introduction to the fragility of love and family. What should have been a new beginning turned into absence, the first silent room that would haunt his private life. He never spoke about it much, but friends noted the way his eyes clouded when the memory returned. It was a wound that whispered through his earliest attempts at songwriting songs where yearning and sorrow always seemed to slip beneath the surface of joy. Later came Jane Asher, the actress, whose red hair and poise marked her as a rising star of the London scene. They met in 1963 and for 5 years became one of Britain's golden couples. She opened Paul's world to art, theater, and literature, challenging his provincial edges and giving him a glimpse of a different life. By Christmas 1967, they were engaged, their faces splashed across tabloids, as if destiny itself had chosen them. But the weight of fame and Paul's own restlessness pulled them apart. In July 1968, Jane announced on national television that their engagement was over. It was more than heartbreak. It was exposure. Paul, the most private of men when it came to matters of the heart, had seen his hopes unraveled in the glare of cameras. What the world saw was a Beatle losing his fiancée. What Paul felt was another quiet confirmation that even love could be stolen when the lights were too bright. Around him swirled rumors and fleeting connections. Names like Peggy Lipton, Francie Schwartz, and others were whispered in gossip columns, some true, some imagined. Paul himself rarely indulged the circus. He moved through fame carrying his heart like fragile glass, unwilling to gamble tenderness against spectacle. Behind the frenzy of Beatlemania, his silence spoke louder than the headlines. He longed not for tabloid romance, but for sincerity, for something that could endure. That longing found its answer in Linda Eastman. They met in 1967 at a London nightclub, and by 1969, just as the Beatles were dissolving, they married. Linda was not only his partner, but his anchor, a photographer who saw the world not through fame's distortions, but through moments of intimacy and truth. Together, they built a family, Heather, whom Paul adopted as his own, and the children they shared, Mary, Stella, and James. Linda was at his side not only in their home, but on stage playing keyboards in Wings, enduring ridicule from critics who dismissed her skills, yet never wavering in loyalty. Their love was not glamour, but sanctuary. In an industry that devoured relationships, theirs was a defiant testimony that partnership could be a shield against the storm. But fate, merciless as ever, prepared its cruelest blow. In 1998, Linda succumbed to breast cancer after a long, agonizing fight. Paul later confessed, "I cried for about a year, on and off." The man whose songs had lifted millions could not lift himself from grief. Their home, once filled with laughter and the chaos of children, fell into silence. He had been by her side through every treatment, every fragile hope, only to find himself staring at an empty chair, a bed that no longer warmed with her presence. For the public, it was the loss of a famous couple. For Paul, it was the theft of the only sanctuary he had ever known. The tragedy echoed another loss that had already scarred him deeply: the murder of John Lennon in 1980. Their partnership had been turbulent, their friendship strained in the years after the Beatles' breakup. Yet nothing could prepare Paul for the news that John had been shot outside his New York home. Outwardly, he appeared stoic, but in private, he turned to music as confession. Here Today, written in John's memory, was a song shaped like a conversation they never got to finish. To sing it was to grieve aloud. To audiences it was tribute, but to Paul it was unfinished business with a brother taken too soon. These double tragedies, John and Linda, became the twin scars on his heart. They were not storms that passed, but companions that lingered. Grief became a presence at his side, reshaping itself into silence, into distance, into the gentle compassion he extended to strangers and colleagues. He spoke little about his pain, but it lived in the spaces between his words, in the way he treated those around him, in the small acts of kindness that revealed the weight he carried. For Paul, grief was not destruction, but a shaping force, hollowing him, yet also deepening him, giving him empathy that applause could never teach. In the years that followed, he learned to move again tentatively. Music became therapy, the only language he trusted when words failed. Songs like "Maybe I'm Amazed" and later works carried echoes of Linda's presence, tributes to a love that had defined him. In time, he remarried, finding companionship with Nancy Shevell in 2011. It was not a replacement, but a quiet continuation, proof that life, however fractured, could still offer moments of peace. Fame had given Paul McCartney applause, but heartbreak gave him depth. The boy who lost his mother, the man who lost his brother in music, the husband who buried his beloved, became more than a star. He became a vessel of humanity, resilience, and compassion. In the silence left behind by loss, Paul carried love in the only way left, through kindness that never needed applause. And in that truth, the tragedy of his life became its most enduring gift to the world. Life had never been gentle with Paul McCartney, and it would not soften as he grew older. This time, fate's cruelty arrived not as the sudden violence of an assassin's bullet, but as the slow erosion of a beloved partner's strength. To the world, he was the eternal Beatle, the voice that made stadiums sing and generations believe in love. But away from the spotlight, he was a husband in a quiet hospital room, watching the woman who had been his anchor fade under the merciless grip of illness. The applause outside grew deafening, inside silence pressed against the walls. Linda McCartney's diagnosis of breast cancer in the mid-1990s shattered the fragile illusion that fame could protect them. Paul, who once carried the weight of Beatlemania, now carried the weight of endless nights at her side. Friends recall how he arranged his life around her treatments, flying back between concerts and recording sessions, determined to make sure she never felt alone. He read aloud, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead, whispered reassurances when chemotherapy drained her body, and sat in silence when words failed. No cameras captured those moments. He did not perform them for history. They were simply acts of devotion. When Linda passed in 1998, Paul admitted, "I cried for about a year." It was the grief of a man who had given everything, and still found himself powerless. Yet, out of that helplessness, he built legacy, the Linda McCartney Center for Cancer Treatment in Liverpool, his support for vegetarianism and animal rights, and initiatives like Meat-Free Monday that turned personal loss into public good. As if to test him further, another cruel farewell arrived in 2001. George Harrison, his bandmate and younger brother in spirit, lost his battle with cancer. Paul described George as my baby brother, and the loss carved into him with a force no rehearsal could prepare for. He remembered the final phone call, George's voice faint but filled with peace, and afterward, the unbearable silence. At the concert for George, Paul took up a ukulele and played Something in Tribute, his voice trembling the notes, carrying more absence than sound. To the audience, it was homage. To Paul, it was a conversation with a brother who should have been there strumming beside him. From that night onward, George became an invisible presence. In every stage, Paul walked upon a ghost, in the wings of every encore. These wounds stacked upon one another could have driven a man into bitterness. Instead, they reshaped Paul's philosophy. Youth and brilliance, he learned, were no shield against the inevitable. Fame could not heal a friend's lungs or a wife's body. Grief changes shape, but it never ends, he once said, and in those words lived the hard-won truth of a man who had buried too many. Out of sorrow, he cultivated empathy. While others flaunted wealth, Paul gave quietly funding research supporting hospitals, championing animal welfare, and reminding audiences that kindness, not celebrity, was the highest calling. The boy who once strummed a cheap guitar in Liverpool had become a man who carried entire causes on his back, not for applause, but for gratitude to the doctors and nurses who had tried to save Linda, to the healers who had comforted George, and to the strangers who would face their own battles. By the time the 21st century advanced, Paul's greatness could no longer be measured only in chart positions or sold-out arenas. His wounds had become wisdom, his scars transformed into compassion. He sang not just to entertain, but to carry others to turn private grief into public comfort. The world will remember the Beatle who changed music, but those who looked closer saw something rarer, a man who endured the loss of wife and brother and still chose to answer sorrow with tenderness. True greatness, his life seems to whisper, is not in how high one climbs, but in how gently one carries others along the way. Greatness always exacts a price, and for Paul McCartney, the bill has been collected not in gold records or sold-out arenas, but in the quiet toll carved into his body and soul. To the public, he remains the immortal Beatle, a figure whose smile seems untouched by time, but behind the lights lives an older truth. At 83, the applause has softened, yet the strain lingers like scars, etched into stone. Every ovation carried weight. Every song demanded something irretrievable, until the legend of invincibility gave way to the fragility of a man who has given more than most could ever endure. The sacrifices began early, long before the world crowned him. In the fever of Beatlemania, Paul and his bandmates endured schedules so relentless they bordered on cruelty. In 1963 alone, they played nearly 300 shows crisscrossing Britain, by van often collapsing into hotel rooms at dawn, only to wake hours later for radio sessions. Jet lag became permanent when they conquered America in 1964, where The Ed Sullivan Show reached 73 million viewers and turned 4 Liverpool boys into the most recognized faces on earth. For Paul, each performance was a vow never to disappoint the audience, a silent contract that demanded his youth, his rest, even his hearing. The tinnitus that later plagued him began in those years, a constant reminder that the screams which once lifted him also stole something he could never regain. Yet the demands did not relent when the Beatles dissolved. In the 1970s, Paul rebuilt himself with wings carrying his wife Linda and their children across continents. The tours were less polished than the Beatles, but more punishing in their grind. Endless rehearsals, late-night writing sessions, the strain of proving himself all over again, these became his new reality. In Lagos, Nigeria, recording Band on the Run, they endured stolen tapes, broken equipment, even threats in the streets. Yet Paul forced himself forward, driven by discipline and pride. Decades later, solo tours in the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond demanded the same devotion. Night after night, he stood beneath stadium lights, singing songs first written by a teenager in Liverpool, his voice carrying both the brilliance of youth and the fatigue of years. Each show left him drained, but he never complained. His silence was its own endurance, a refusal to let the world see the cost. Time, however, is merciless. As Paul entered his 70s and then his 80s, the toll became visible. His once effortless stride slowed, his breath between songs grew heavier, and subtle tremors betrayed the years. In 2016, whispers circulated about canceled shows due to health concerns. In 2020, during the stillness of the pandemic, he admitted that recovery took longer now that rehearsals required gentler pacing, that even his hands sometimes stiffened against the bass he had mastered since boyhood. But where others might see decline, Paul found humility. He adapted, embracing rituals of rest and care. He traded exhaustion for moderation, learning that wisdom meant bowing to limits without surrendering the spirit that still burned to create. These visible signs, the careful steps onto stage, the fleeting wince hidden by a smile, the occasional falter in voice, are not weakness. They are monuments of sacrifice, reminders of the devotion poured into every song. Fans see the Beatle, who will forever be 22 on grainy black and white screens, but before them now stands a man who carries history in his very frame. Each scar, each line, each weary breath is proof that music, like love, demands its price. His endurance itself has become part of his legacy. Beyond the roar of concerts, Paul's sanctuary lies in his home's The Farm in Sussex, where he has lived for decades, the East Hampton Retreat in America. Quiet spaces designed not for spectacle, but for peace. The Sussex farm, with its rolling fields and simple farmhouse, is where he found healing after Linda's death, where gardens bloom with the gentleness she loved, where photographs still keep her presence alive. These are not estates built to flaunt fortune, but temples of calm. In the hush of dawn, Paul walks through gardens that hold both memory and renewal, a reminder that even legends need shelter from the noise of the world. In that shelter, companionship returned. In 2011, Paul married Nancy Shevell, a woman outside the glare of pop stardom, whose quiet strength became a balm after years of loss. Their love is not paraded across magazines, but lived in daily rituals, shared breakfasts, evening walks, conversations away from cameras. After decades of tragedy and solitude, this companionship offered him redemption, the chance to live not as an icon, but as a man allowed to be tender again. Friends note that with Nancy, Paul seems lighter, more at ease, as if he has finally found a balance between memory and the present. Even now, Paul refuses to surrender his craft. In 2020, during lockdown, he recorded McCartney III almost entirely alone, layering instruments as he had done 50 years earlier. He collaborates with younger artists, lending wisdom while drawing energy from their newness. His book, The Lyrics, published in 2021, turned his songs into autobiography, offering fans a rare window into the man behind the melodies. At this stage, he chooses projects not by necessity, but by resonance. "I only want to do what makes my heart beat faster," he once said. And at 83, he has earned the right to follow only that compass. His humanitarian legacy is equally enduring. Out of Linda's death grew the Linda McCartney Center in Liverpool, a hospital dedicated to cancer treatment and research. Out of their shared vegetarianism came Linda McCartney Foods, and later his advocacy for Meat-Free Monday, a campaign that blended personal belief with environmental urgency. He has supported animal rights organizations, donated quietly to hospitals, and lent his name to causes that seek healing rather than applause. These gestures are not headlines, but they are the quiet footprints of a man who has chosen to turn grief into generosity. The boy who once lost his mother, the man who buried his wife and bandmates, now honors them not through bitterness, but through kindness. In the end, Paul McCartney's story is not only about the songs that filled airwaves or the records that broke charts. It is about the price he paid, the fragility he embraced, and the compassion he carried forward. His scars are not blemishes, they are monuments. His silence is not emptiness, it is resilience. His steps may be slower, but each one carries the weight of decades given freely to the world. True greatness, his life reveals, is not measured by how high one climbs, but by how gently one carries others along the way. In the fading light of his 8th decade, Paul McCartney has turned wounds into wisdom, losses into love, and silence into music. And perhaps that is his final gift, proof that even after the loudest applause fades, the quiet song of compassion will endure. And now the question belongs to you. Paul McCartney has given more than 6 decades of his life to music, to audiences, to causes larger than himself. At 83, every step he takes onto a stage is both a miracle and a reminder of the cost of devotion. Do you believe he should continue to share his voice with the world? Or should he finally rest in the sanctuary he has so patiently earned? Has his journey through the ecstasy of Beatlemania, the heartbreak of losing John Lennon, George Harrison, and Linda, and the resilience of carrying on, touched your own life? Do his words about grief, never ending, only changing shape, resonate with you in your own losses? If his story has stirred something within, you share your reflections below. Tell us what his songs have meant to you, how his story has mirrored your own, or how his resilience has inspired you to carry on. And if you believe, as we do, that stories like Paul's deserve to be remembered and cherished, subscribe and stand with us in honoring lives that prove compassion and endurance shine brighter than fame itself.